In the spring of 2010, I turned 19 and completed my first year of college. To celebrate, my parents took me and my best friend out to dinner to Don Pablo's. We arrived and strolled to the entrance of the restaurant, chatting amongst each other. I recall that my mom was once again overloading me with questions about college girls. That's probably why I failed to notice the man running toward us with a baseball bat. The man bounced off of me, pushed my dad to the side, and ran into the parking lot. Obviously confused, we focused our attention back to the restaurant. At the entrance of the men's bathroom lay a Latino man in a puddle of blood. Still breathing, but badly beaten, it was apparent that this man had been brutally assaulted by the man who had ran past us at the door. Weeks later, we discovered that the man who was responsible for the attack was arrested for aggravated assault. If convicted, he faced decades behind bars as punishment. Our justice system protects us by removing dangerous people like this from society. But not all of this country's prisoners are dangerous, violent offenders. In fact, roughly half of all individuals imprisoned here have committed nonviolent crimes. Thus, the relevant question seems to be, should the penalties for nonviolent crimes be reduced? Should all crimes be punishable by imprisonment? These questions appear increasingly relevant as both the population of our prisons and the cost of holding these prisoners continue to rise. In a time of financial crisis, our state governments spend over $50 billion annually to maintain prisons throughout the country. That doesn't even include the cost of judicial processing, which is predicted to be much higher. These massive costs are understandable, as the United States is the world's leader in producing prisoners. It possesses the largest national prison population in the world, with over 2 million people behind bars. If we ignore population size, the U.S. still has a higher incarceration rate than any other nation, with 751 people in prison for every 100,000 people in population. The only other nation that comes close is Russia, with 627 prisoners per 100,000 in population. So what, you may ask? Perhaps our American culture somehow produces greater numbers of criminals. Well, not necessarily. For example, while the United States does have a higher murder rate than comparable industrialized nations, it does not have an overall higher crime rate. In fact, in comparison to countries such as England, Australia, and Canada, the U.S. has relatively low rates of nonviolent crimes such as burglary and automobile theft. Thus, comparing crime rates of other nations does not effectively explain America's disproportionately high rates of incarceration. However, is it possible that American culture is to blame? Are Americans inclined to be less sympathetic toward offenders? Intriguingly, many scholars who have investigated the causes of America's high imprisonment rates usually point to America's war on drugs and generally harsher penalties for crimes. As one writer points out, it is the length of sentences that truly distinguishes American prison policy. For instance, burglars in America spend an average of 16 months in prison per sentence, whereas burglars in Canada and England serve only 5 and 7 months, respectively. These unusually high sentences translate to drug offenders as well, and the war on drugs has been responsible for drastically increasing America's prison population. In fact, since 1980, the number of people in prison for drug crimes has increased tenfold, although drug usage has not increased as dramatically. Whatever the cause, there is no question that these statistics exist. Ultimately, the true question is, are the benefits of world-high incarceration worth the costs? There is no question that incarceration is necessary to remove dangerous individuals from society. Surprisingly, some individuals even argue that it was America's lax sentencing policies that contributed to skyrocketing crime rates in the 1960s. They attribute decreasing crime rates in the 1990s and into the present day to stiffer sentencing policies. By taking dangerous offenders off the street, they argue, we effectively lowered crime rates. Beyond that, lengthy incarceration times for non-violent crimes sometimes help authorities to remove otherwise untouchable offenders from society. For instance, dangerous mob leader Al Capone was eventually imprisoned not for murder, but for tax evasion. However, there are obvious financial and moral costs associated with such a justice system. As explained earlier, managing prisons costs states billions of dollars annually. But prison sentences come with a high price for prisoners too, even after they are released from their cell. By sentencing so many nonviolent offenders, our country has produced a sizable population of people who have difficulty finding employment, receiving aid for higher education, gaining access to welfare, and in some states such as Maryland, even voting. Essentially, ex-convicts are branded for life, and sometimes with good reason. But these labels are so strong that they often lead ex-cons back to criminal lifestyles, therefore failing to remedy the crime problem. It is likely that some elements of our criminal justice system are in need of a reevaluation. Through my own experiences, I understand that certain individuals present a danger to the well-being of our communities. The question of how nonviolent offenders should be treated, however, has yet to be resolved.